Good evening. Welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. On tonight's programme, we'll be taking a look at Nigeria following further attacks in the north of the country and at China as the nation seeks to draft new terror laws. But first, as Prime Minister David Cameron ordered a new inquiry into the treatment of the killer of Lee Rigby by the British security services, and this follows a revelation that the man that the world knew as Jihadi John has been treated in a similar manner by MI5 before leaving for Syria. Yesterday, we reported from a press conference held by the human rights advocacy group CAGE. They have said that they believe there is a link between the conduct of the security services towards some Muslims and the process of radicalisation.
Swallowing a bitter pill is never something anyone enjoys. But after revelations yesterday afternoon, it could be said many or too few were feeling the weight and bearing of the path undertaken by a man who came to be known as Jihadi John. Mohammed Emwazi, a young 26-year-old from London, identified as the British killer who has appeared in various videos released by the Islamic State group, didn't simply not turn up to school one day, but rather is alleged to be a man targeted by security services at a point in which he seemingly had committed no crime. Unmasked publicly for the first time earlier today, the causes which led to Emwazi's current state continue to be debated. But following accusations made by human rights advocacy group CAGE, today, the Prime Minister has ordered an inquiry into the security services. An inquiry not into the case of Mohammed Emwazi, but that of Michael Adebolajo, the killer of Fusilier Lee Rigby. The inquiry will centre on how MI6 dealt with claims from Adebolajo that he was badly treated during his detention in Kenya in 2010. Adebolajo made the claims against Kenya's counter-terrorism police, a force with close ties to Britain. There is no current date set for when the new inquiry will report, but following the order into the conduct of security services and any role they played in the life of Adebolajo before the Woolwich attacks.
What happened yesterday in Woolwich has sickened us all.
There's a heightened sense of agitation within the British public into how they should respond to the allegations made by CAGE and the behaviour of MI5. Yasmin Khatun, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss the topic is Cerie Bullivant from CAGE, Afzal Ashraf, who's a consultant fellow at RUSI, and Professor Rizwan Saabir, who's a lecturer at Edgehill University. Welcome to the programme, all of you. First of all, it's a quite staggering contrast, actually, because on the same day that CAGE released these revelations, there was a huge furore surrounding that, for and against. And then in the evening of the same day, David Cameron says, well, actually, there needs to be a new inquiry into how the security services treated Michael Adebolajo, the killer of Lee Rigby, because there is concern that he was attempted to be recruited and badly treated and whatnot. What do you make of that juxtaposition?
Well, it's obvious that people want to find out what's going on, and I think it's a very good thing that the government is recognising that we need to look at these things and learn from them. What that doesn't necessarily mean is that that those allegations are well-founded. We will find out to what degree there are grounds for the allegations that have been made. But it's a very good thing that the government is looking at this thing and trying to get to the bottom of anything that can be done to learn the lessons. The very important thing to remember is this, that even if these guys were treated badly, even if their legitimate legal rights were in some way infringed, what we have to ask is, what is the grounds for these people infringing the legal rights, the human rights, the lives of innocent people that they butchered physically? So I don't think that any mistreatment, if it is found to exist, necessarily excuses the actions that these men went on to commit.
I think we're all clear about that. I mean, that point has been made, I think, universally by CAGE and by others. It's not really about justification, it's about explanation. And if you don't have a good explanation, you can't stop it happening again. Was that your point? Are you surprised at the criticism you got for making that point?
The thing is, it's not about the what, it's about the why. And fundamentally, if we want to stop these things from happening again, we need a robust inquiry into what happened in not just these two cases, but many, many others, where the security services have been part and parcel of the radicalisation process. I'm completely willing to admit that that's unwitting, But the policies that they're pushing and the way that they're handling these cases are making the situation worse. We see in the case of the person now known as Jihadi John, that he was looking to get married and get a good job and settle down. If that had happened, if our security services hadn't have stopped him, would he now be cutting off heads in Iraq?
Professor Saabir, were you surprised at the reaction to the revelations? Because, I mean, as Kerry put it there, you might not agree with him, but it's a point that should be discussed, and yet it caused a huge fuss, didn't it?
Yes, it was quite interesting how strong the reaction of the mainstream media was to Cage's explanation as to what may have facilitated or certainly contributed to the so-called radicalisation of Mohammed Emwazi. What was also interesting is that Cage were quite clearly articulating that what Mohammed Emwazi was an individual that they knew. They did not know what he became. And that was the key point that was lost in all of the media discussion and debate that subsequently took place. So they knew him in a past tense when he came to Cage asking for help, but the media kind of convoluted and diluted that point. And I think it was slightly unfair on the points that were being made by Cage. And Cage also raised a really important point, and that was to put onto the agenda a very important point, and that is to what extent are our own policies and programs creating a threat in the name of fighting a threat that we're constantly faced with.
Now, so you've been involved in the Prevent scheme, and in its sort of first incarnation towards the end of the last Labour government, it came in for some quite heavy criticism from Commons committees and whatnot. Is it currently operating any differently?
Yes, the strategy was revised, and one of the major changes was that it would be targeting extremism, full stop. And that had two very important consequences. That, of course, it didn't identify a particular community. Extremism comes in all forms, right-wing extremism, Islamic extremism. But also, in the case of Islamist extremism, for want of a better word, it prevents those extremists from associating themselves or having the, if you like, apparent legitimacy by saying, well, we're Islamic, we're Muslims. They're not part of society as such. They're identified as extremists and they're dealt with as extremists. So that's one of the things that, that it did. The problem, of course, with prevent is the word prevent. It suggests that we can prevent it. And you can't prevent extremism. You can minimize it, but there will be people who will, for whatever reason, have extremist views and will be violent. You can only minimize the number of people who go down that route.
Kerry, I know that you won't agree with that picture of prevent, but I'd like to ask you a slightly different question, which has emerged out of the whole sort of attention that Cage has got, and that is that, in a way, what you were doing with Mohammed Emwazi was a kind of pastoral thing. You were trying to solve some of the problems that he had, in the hope, presumably, that it wouldn't end up in where he went. Or, I mean, you didn't know where he was going, but part of what you were trying to do is to deal with that. Now, could there be a programme which dealt with the issues that are raised by terrorism, which could succeed in that way?
The fact of the matter is that if you want to deal with these sorts of issues, firstly, you need credible people, and you don't need a one-size-fits-all government approach of box ticking. The Prevent programme fundamentally sucks the middle ground out of any sort of debate on these sorts of issues. We find people like Sheikh Haytham, who, although he's conservative and may have views that many people find upsetting, he isn't a violent extremist. And the only reason that Prevent targets people like him who have a very large following, and by stopping people like him, they alienate massive amounts of the Muslim community, is because of this broken academic model called conveyor belt. This idea that non-violent extremism automatically leads to violence. The problem is, what they define as non-violent extremism in any other context is referred to as orthodoxy or conservatism. and is allowed with other communities, yet not with the Muslims.
Professor Saabir, I mean, there was a lot of talk before this of concentration by the government on non-violent extremism. We heard government ministers using this phrase. The Panorama programme used this phrase. It seems to be moving in the opposite direction to the one that Cerie is suggesting might be useful.
Yeah, the approach that the government has essentially taken since the review was announced into Prevent in around 2010 was that even though the focus was going to be on non-violent ideas, or what they call non-violent extremism, the interventions under counterterrorism and the Prevent program, specifically Channel, have become more harder-edged. Now, what that basically means is that there is more secrecy surrounding the entire Prevent program, especially the Channel program. So apart from really the number of people that are being recommended, it's extremely difficult to find out who is undertaking the interventions, who are the people that are actually being subjected to the interventions, and so on and so forth. So even though the target is now a lot more broader, you could say, the program is a lot more secretive. And I think therein arises the problem, especially as an academic. You know, my job is to try and understand government policy in order to critique it so as to come up with more informed and nuanced policy, but without actually being given any help in order to understand the program. How can people like myself, or even for that fact, even people like Afzal, come up with a more reasoned and nuanced understanding?
Okay, let me ask Afzal about that in the studio. In this particular case, it's probably, because of the record of involvement with Cage, it's probably one of the clearest and most documented pictures that we have of somebody over time developing. I mean, you said that you know that you think if the security services did things wrong, they should be held to account. But do you think there's anything else that we could learn from this detailed picture of somebody?
First of all, I'm not sure that we have a detailed picture. We have a picture, but there are lots of bits missing, very important bits missing. And if you ignore those important gaps, you assume that this chap was in some sort of trouble, went to Cage, a few things happened, he was mistreated, and so consequently he felt he was pushed over the edge and became a monster. I think that's oversimplistic. I've tried to look at his stories as it's emerging. There are huge gaps. And having looked at how others have become violent extremists, there are many things at play, many social factors, many psychological factors. It's never just one thing. So I think that that presumption that we have a good case here is I don't think right. I've seen far more detailed cases that we can learn from. But we should learn from it. We will learn from it. I'm sure the government will do its best. I think academics will monitor this thing and evaluate his history as much as possible. And I'm sure we will all be better for it. But I think just one case with those gaps is not going to teach us a great deal at this stage.
Cerie, you're at the centre of a huge kind of backlash over releasing this. Do you think that, in a way, you released too little and that the case was too narrow and that that's part of it? Is there more to come?
There are some more bits to come, and there's some more information which will be breaking soon, especially on how the security services came to be interested in this gentleman, and I think that's going to be very, very groundbreaking when it comes.
So do you think what we've got at the moment is perhaps too simplistic to carry as much weight as you'd like it to?
I think what we've got at the moment paints a 2-year picture of a man constantly trying to get his life back on the rails, constantly trying to get married, settle down, move his life forward in a way that we all seek to do in our general day-to-day life. And we see a pattern of the security services stopping that and getting involved. We see a pattern of even the police pinning him up against the wall and strangling him. Now this is obviously a chilling simile when you look at what he ended up doing to other people. And I think it's very, very important that we, for once, actually look at what people are saying as to what the causes of radicalisation is on them, and take that as a source, rather than just relying on, to be frank, think tanks and policymakers that haven't ever spoken to the primary sources here.
Professor Saabir, how much weight do you think it's right to attach to that treatment by the security services? I mean, on the one hand, there are a number of commentators saying, well, you know, was he treated that badly? Is it enough to make somebody into a killer? There's a lot of that kind of discussion going around. On the other hand, you feel that perhaps the people who are saying it have never spent any time in a cell, don't know how frightening it is to be in that situation.
Well, I think any policy needs to be informed from the bottom up. If it's a top-down approach, which is ultimately what Prevent was when it was introduced in 2006, it was riddled with many, many problems and complications and issues, some of which have been, rightly accepted to have been problematic and therefore redressed. But ultimately, there is no specific pathway as to why an individual becomes involved in violence. Now, Mohammed Emwazi and his involvement with MI5, what role did that play, was the question. I think there are a number of different contributing factors, and that's not only from this case, but many other cases when it comes down to violence, political violence. But I think the role that the MI5 treatment will have played is significant. It can't be discounted, but it can't be put forward as the only reason as to why Mohammed Emwazi became a violent individual. And I think we have to recognize that some people will claim that he was ideologically motivated and a religious zealot that ultimately was driven to violence. But this clearly shows that there are clearly created political factors that are contributing to why an ideology and how an ideology is given sanctity. And I think until there is a recognition that it's ultimately politics that is driving forward individuals towards violence and acts of gross murder, I think there will be a real shortcoming in finding solutions to the problem.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining in that discussion, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on the topic. Do stay with us for the second part of the show, where we'll be taking a look at the rest of today's top stories and what's been trending on Twitter. See you after the break.